The city hummed with its usual rhythm, yellow cabs cutting through the late afternoon haze, strangers brushing shoulders, and the faint echo of saxophones spilling from a jazz bar nearby. Olivia Hart sat by the window of a narrow Brooklyn apartment, her fingers tracing the rim of a chipped coffee mug. Across from her, Daniel Brooks typed slowly on his old typewriter, the rhythmic clack of keys filling the silence that had grown between them. He didn't need music. The noise of creation was his melody. Olivia used to love that sound. It made her feel like she was part of something beautiful and unspoken. But tonight, it grated on her nerves. She had just returned from a meeting at the advertising agency where she worked as a junior copywriter. It had been her big break, presenting a campaign to Mark Evans, the creative director, a man everyone in the firm seemed to either admire or fear. Mark had listened to her ideas with sharp, knowing eyes, and for the first time in months, she'd felt seen, truly seen. "You're quiet," Daniel said without looking up. His voice was low, soft, the kind that could calm a storm or make silence heavier. "Just tired," Olivia murmured, setting her mug down. She didn't tell him about the thrill of standing in that sleek glass office, the way Mark's voice had carried authority, or how his hand had brushed hers when he handed back her notes. She didn't tell him that for a fleeting second she had imagined herself in a different life, one that wasn't confined to peeling wallpaper and the sound of a typewriter. Daniel stopped typing. "You've been somewhere else lately," he said quietly, "not just tired, distant." Olivia looked at him, at the man she had once believed she'd spend her life with. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled, ink smudged on his fingers. There was tenderness in his eyes, but also a quiet ache. She wanted to love him the way she used to, but something inside her had shifted. "Maybe I just want more," she whispered. He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that hides a wound. "More than this? Or more than me?" She didn't answer. Outside, the city lights flickered on, one by one, like 1,000 confessions being whispered to the night. They had met 5 years ago in a bookstore downtown. She was 24, fresh out of college, dreaming of writing campaigns that would change the world. He was a struggling novelist, selling signed copies of his self-published book for a few dollars apiece. They talked for hours about art, about meaning, about love that survives despite everything. And for a while, it had been enough. They built their life out of second-hand furniture and endless belief. But love, Olivia thought now, is not always strong enough to compete with the hunger for something bigger. When she looked at Daniel, she saw peace. When she looked at Mark, she saw possibility. That night, as Daniel read her an excerpt from his latest story, a tale about a man who loses the woman he loves to the allure of the city, she couldn't help but feel like he was writing about them. "It's good," she said softly, though her mind was elsewhere. He smiled at her approval, unaware that her heart was already drifting. Days turned into weeks. Mark began to linger after meetings, asking her opinions, laughing at her jokes, inviting her to rooftop parties filled with people who seemed untouchable. Olivia tried to resist the pull, but every encounter made her question the life she shared with Daniel. One evening, Mark walked her home after a late brainstorming session. The air was cool, the street lamps throwing long shadows across the sidewalk. "You don't belong here," he said suddenly, glancing at the modest brownstone where she lived. "You've got too much light to be hidden away in a place like this." She laughed softly. "You don't even know me." "I know ambition when I see it," he said, stopping at her door. "You want more than comfort, Olivia. You want to be seen, remembered." His words lingered long after he left. When she stepped inside, Daniel was asleep on the couch, a manuscript resting on his chest. She looked at him for a long time, wondering when love had started to feel like an anchor instead of a home. Weeks later, Olivia stood in front of the mirror, dressed for a company gala. Daniel came up behind her, adjusting her necklace, his touch gentle but hesitant. "You look beautiful," he said. She turned, catching the reflection of both of them in the mirror, her in a sleek black dress, him in his worn shirt, sleeves rolled up. Two different worlds, two different futures. "Daniel," she began, but the words caught in her throat. "How do you tell someone you're slipping away?" The gala was dazzling, filled with champagne laughter and flashing cameras. Mark's presence dominated the room, confident, magnetic, impossible to ignore. When he pulled her aside and whispered, "Stay a little longer," she didn't resist. Later, under the neon glow of the city skyline, Mark kissed her. It was impulsive, reckless, intoxicating. For the first time, she felt alive and terrified all at once. The guilt came crashing afterward, heavy and suffocating. She returned home past midnight, her heart pounding, her lipstick faded. Daniel was waiting by the window, his typewriter still open, a single sheet of paper blank before him. "You didn't call," he said quietly. "I was working late," she replied, her voice trembling. He studied her for a moment, then simply nodded. "Okay." He didn't ask questions. He didn't shout. He just turned away and began typing again. But the sound no longer felt like music. It sounded like goodbye. Days later, Olivia packed her things. She didn't explain. She couldn't. Daniel stood by the door watching her, his face unreadable. "You don't have to say it," he said softly. "I already know." She wanted to apologize, to beg him to understand that she wasn't leaving because she stopped loving him, but because she no longer knew how to love him without losing herself. Instead, she whispered, "I'm sorry." Daniel didn't reply. He stepped aside, letting her go. The door closed behind her with a soft click, the kind of sound that echoes long after it fades. Outside, the city was alive and indifferent. Olivia looked back once, but the window was dark. She didn't see Daniel as he sat back down, staring at the blank page before typing the first words of what would one day become his most haunting novel. She chose another man, and I left quietly. 2 years had passed since Olivia closed the door on the life she once knew. New York still shimmered with the same cruel beauty, but now she viewed it from glass towers instead of cramped apartments. The office of Evans and Company Advertising was perched high above Madison Avenue, a place where ambition was currency and exhaustion was the price of belonging. Olivia had learned to play the game well. Tailored suits, quick smiles, the art of masking vulnerability beneath confidence. Mark Evans had kept his promise. He made her visible. She was now his lead strategist, a name whispered with admiration in the firm's corridors. Yet every victory carried a quiet hollowness she couldn't explain. She and Mark had become inseparable. Partners at work, lovers in secret, later husband and wife in a lavish ceremony that drew envy from colleagues and praise from the press. To the world, they were a power couple, the creative genius and the visionary muse. But behind the photographs and headlines, cracks were already forming. Mark was brilliant, but his brilliance came with storms. He thrived on control, meetings scheduled to the minute, expectations carved in stone, emotions treated like weaknesses. He loved Olivia, or perhaps he loved the reflection of himself he saw in her success. When she laughed too freely at someone else's joke, his jaw tightened. When she stayed late at work without telling him first, he questioned her loyalty. "You're distracted," he told her one night as they sat in their penthouse overlooking the skyline. "I need you focused. We have the biggest pitch of the year next week." "I'm focused," Olivia said, though her thoughts had drifted elsewhere, to a simpler time, a simpler voice that once said her name without judgment. Mark poured himself a drink. "You were extraordinary once. Don't let comfort make you soft." His words stung. She wasn't sure which hurt more, the insult or the fact that a part of her believed him. That night, when he fell asleep, she scrolled through old photos on her phone, ones she hadn't deleted. Daniel at the typewriter, sunlight on his face, his quiet smile. She wondered if he'd finished the story he was writing when she left. She wondered if he ever forgave her. At work, whispers began to circulate. Mark's charm extended beyond his marriage. His late-night meetings with an intern named Grace were becoming harder to dismiss as professional. Olivia heard the rumors first from a colleague, then from silence. His growing absence, the shift in how he touched her, as though intimacy had turned into a chore. She didn't confront him at first. She was too proud, too afraid of confirming what she already knew. One evening, while searching for a file on his laptop before a presentation, she found an email. Careless, passionate, undeniable. It wasn't the betrayal that broke her. It was how familiar the words felt. They were the same kind of reckless desires she once shared with him when she had been the other woman. The irony hit her with cruel precision. That night she sat alone on the balcony, the city stretched out below her like a trap made of light. When Mark came home, smelling faintly of cologne that wasn't hers, she didn't speak. He poured himself whiskey, loosened his tie, and said, "You look tired." "So do you," she replied, her voice steady but hollow. "Late night?" He looked at her, his expression unreadable. "You're not going to start playing detective, are you? We've both got too much to lose for drama." The coldness in his tone frightened her more than anger would have. She realized then that love, when reduced to strategy, becomes cruelty. In the weeks that followed, Olivia buried herself in work. The company's new campaign, a luxury perfume called Elysium, was meant to capture the essence of desire and regret. Ironically, it mirrored her life. As she crafted taglines about forbidden longing, she felt like she was writing her own confession. Late one night, after everyone had left, she sat in the darkened office, staring at the city beyond the glass. The reflection in the window looked foreign, polished, exhausted, lonely. Her phone buzzed. It was an industry newsletter announcing the finalists for the National Literary Award. One of the shortlisted authors was Daniel Brooks for his novel, The Quiet Leaving. Her breath caught. The summary was brief but enough, a haunting exploration of love lost and the silence that follows betrayal. She closed the laptop, her pulse quickening. Memories rushed back, the smell of coffee, the scratch of his typewriter, the way he once looked at her as though she was both muse and home. That night, Olivia dreamed of Daniel. He was standing by the East River, holding a manuscript, his voice calm but distant. "You chose," he said, "and I left. We both did what we had to." She woke up before dawn, tears on her face. In the following days, she couldn't shake the thought of him. She looked up his interviews online. In one, when asked if his book was based on real events, Daniel smiled faintly and said, "Every story comes from something true, but truth doesn't always belong to those who tell it." Olivia felt exposed, as if the world could see her guilt. One afternoon, she stood outside a bookstore on Fifth Avenue, staring at the display where The Quiet Leaving was prominently featured. His name glowed under the soft lights and she couldn't resist. She bought the book. Each page was a mirror she didn't want to face. The protagonist was an artist named Nathan, who loved a woman who chose someone else. The woman's name wasn't Olivia, but every line bled with her presence. The hesitation in her smile, the sound of the door closing, the silence that followed. When she finished, she sat for hours, motionless, staring at the last line. He left not because he stopped loving her, but because love demanded silence when words became lies. That night, she confronted Mark. The affair was no longer a rumor. It was a wound, festering and undeniable. "How long?" she asked quietly. Mark didn't flinch. "Long enough for me to know what I want." "And what's that?" "Control," he said coldly. "You've always needed saving, Olivia. I'm tired of pretending I'm the man to do it." His words were final, sharp as glass. She packed her things the next morning. There were no tears, no scenes, only exhaustion. When she looked at herself in the mirror, she barely recognized the woman staring back. Success had made her visible, but emptiness had made her transparent. She thought of Daniel then, not as a ghost from her past, but as a reminder that love, once broken, leaves an echo that never truly fades. She didn't know it yet, but fate was preparing to bring their paths together again, in the most unexpected of ways. Autumn had come to New York again, carrying with it the bittersweet chill that made the city smell like rain and endings. Olivia moved into a small apartment in Chelsea after leaving Mark. The place was half the size of the penthouse she once shared, but it felt more honest. The walls were bare, the furniture secondhand, yet she breathed easier. There was silence now. Real silence, not the heavy, unspoken kind that had filled her marriage. Her mornings were quiet rituals. Black coffee, walks through the crowded streets, a notebook in her bag that she still hadn't dared to open. She had lost her job at Evans & Company after the divorce. It wasn't an official firing. They just stopped giving her projects, then stopped calling altogether. Power, she realized, had always belonged to Mark. She was invisible again, Only this time it didn't feel like punishment. It felt like a beginning. One evening, as she wandered past a bookstore on West 23rd Street, she saw a poster taped to the window. An evening with Daniel Brooks, reading in Q&A for the quiet leaving. Her breath caught in her throat. The event was scheduled for that Friday. She stared at the date for a long time before whispering, almost to herself, maybe I owe him that much. Friday came with drizzle and wind. Olivia dressed simply. A beige coat, black turtleneck, no makeup. She sat in the back of the small bookstore, surrounded by people who had come to hear him speak. People who knew him as a literary voice, not as the man she once broke. When Daniel walked in, the air shifted. He was different now, older, sharper in presence, but still carrying that same quiet gravity. His hair had touches of gray near the temples, and his posture was confident but unassuming. The audience hushed as he began to read. His voice was deep and calm, every word deliberate. He read from a chapter about a man standing in front of the woman who had left him, not to accuse her, but to thank her for teaching him what silence meant. Olivia's heart clenched. Every sentence felt like a blade wrapped in tenderness. When he finished, the room erupted in applause. She didn't clap. She couldn't. After the signing, people lined up for autographs, some shy, some effusive. Olivia waited until the crowd thinned. When she finally stepped forward, Daniel looked up, and for a moment neither of them moved. Recognition flickered in his eyes, but he didn't speak. "Hello, Daniel," she said softly. "It's been a long time." He nodded slowly, his pen still in hand. "Olivia." Her name came out like a memory he wasn't sure he wanted to say aloud. She placed a copy of The Quiet Leaving on the table. "Will you sign it?" He hesitated, then opened the book. Instead of writing his usual message, he simply signed his name. "Thank you," she whispered. "I read it. Every word felt like us." "It isn't about us," he said quietly. "It's about what's left after us." His tone wasn't cruel, just honest. "I know," she murmured. "Still, I'm sorry. For everything." Daniel met her eyes then, and for the first time, she saw not anger, but distance. A kind of peace that didn't include her. "Sorry is just another word for wanting to feel better," he said. "You don't owe me that. I already made peace with what happened." She wanted to ask if he ever missed her, if he had loved anyone since, but she couldn't. The words stayed locked inside her chest. When she left the store, rain was falling harder. She stood under the awning, watching him through the glass as he smiled at another reader, his laughter easy, natural. It hit her how much she had taken from him. The man she once knew had been gentle and uncertain, but the one standing there now had found strength in her absence. She had taught him pain, and he had turned it into purpose. A week later, she received an email. It was from Daniel's publicist, a polite message saying that Daniel had requested her presence at a small gallery event for an upcoming charity anthology. She reread it 3 times, unsure if it was a mistake. Part of her wanted to ignore it. Another part felt drawn by something she couldn't name. That night, she stood by her window, city lights shimmering below, wondering if forgiveness could ever look like friendship. The gallery was in Soho, minimalist and modern. Daniel was already there when she arrived, speaking with a group of writers. He noticed her immediately but didn't approach. Later, when most guests had left, he walked over. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "Neither was I. I thought you might like to see what we're doing. It's a project for young writers, helping them publish their first work." She smiled faintly. "Still saving the world one story at a time?" He chuckled softly. "No, just trying to give others the chance I almost didn't take." They stood in silence for a moment, surrounded by photographs of city streets and handwritten notes pinned to the walls. "You seem happy," Olivia said quietly. "I am," he replied, "or at least content. Happiness feels too fragile to trust." "I'm glad," she whispered, meaning it more than she expected. "Mark and I know," he interrupted gently. "It's hard to keep secrets in this city." She nodded. It ended the way it began. Beautiful on the surface, hollow underneath. He studied her, his eyes softer now. "You were never hollow, Olivia. Just searching." For the first time in years, she felt the weight of tears she hadn't allowed herself to cry. "I thought I was choosing a future," she said, But I was really just running from who I was. Daniel looked at her for a long moment before saying, "We all run. Some of us just stop sooner than others." Before she could reply, someone called his name from across the room. He excused himself, leaving her alone amid the dim lights and quiet art. She turned toward a photo on the wall, a blurred image of a woman walking away on a rainy street. The caption beneath it read, "Sometimes leaving quietly is the loudest thing you can do." She didn't know if Daniel had chosen it, but she felt it in her bones. When she left the gallery that night, the air was crisp and clear. For the first time in years, she felt both empty and awake. She didn't know what would come next, whether their paths would cross again, or if this was the closure she'd never dared to seek. But as she walked down the quiet street, she knew one thing with aching clarity. She had spent years trying to build a life that looked like success, only to realize she had traded away the one thing that ever made her truly alive, the kind of love that asked for nothing but honesty. Winter came early that year, the kind that turned New York into a city of gray skies and blurred reflections. Olivia's days fell into a quiet rhythm. She freelanced for small advertising projects, enough to pay rent, but not enough to distract her from her thoughts. The nights were harder, those long stretches of silence where she would sit by the window, watching people through rain-streaked glass, wondering how so many could walk through life without looking back. She envied them, their forwardness, their forgetfulness. Her own past clung like perfume that never faded. Daniel's words haunted her, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. He had moved on, found peace, maybe even forgiveness. She was still orbiting the wreckage. One afternoon, she received an invitation to a private gala, celebrating the anthology project Daniel had mentioned. Her first instinct was to decline, but curiosity, or maybe longing, won. She told herself it wasn't about him, that she wanted to be part of something meaningful again. But when she arrived at the Metropolitan Club that Friday night, wearing a simple navy gown and her hair loose around her shoulders, she realized she was lying to herself. She wanted to see him. The room was warm with golden light and the murmur of intellectual chatter. Daniel stood near the center, speaking to a journalist, a glass of champagne in hand. He looked effortlessly composed, dressed in a dark suit, the kind of man who had learned to make solitude look elegant. When he noticed her, he didn't seem surprised. "You came," he said, his smile faint but genuine. "You invited me," she replied. "You didn't have to accept." "I know," she said, "but I wanted to." They spent the evening in polite conversation, surrounded by strangers but drawn only to each other. He told her about the foundation he had started for underprivileged writers. She told him about her freelance work, though she avoided mentioning how lonely it all felt. When the speeches ended and the crowd began to thin, he offered her his arm. "Let's walk," he said. They stepped outside into the cold night, Fifth Avenue nearly empty. Snow began to fall, the soft kind that made the city glow. They walked without direction, their footsteps muffled against the pavement. "Do you ever think about what might have happened if things were different?" she asked quietly. Daniel took a long breath before answering. "Sometimes, but then I remind myself that different doesn't always mean better." "Maybe not better," she said, "just less broken." He looked at her, the faintest sadness behind his calm expression. "Broken isn't always bad, Olivia. Sometimes it's just honest." They stopped at a coffee shop still open past midnight. The warmth inside was comforting, nostalgic almost. They sat by the window, two ghosts from the same story, sharing a table as if time hadn't passed. For a while they didn't speak. Then Daniel said, "I read an old note you left me once. You wrote, 'One day you'll understand why I had to go.' I think I do now." "And why is that?" she asked. "Because you thought love was supposed to save you," he said gently. "But real love doesn't save. It just reveals." His words cut through her like winter air. She looked down at her hands, realizing they were trembling. "You make it sound so simple." "It wasn't," he said. "It took me years to stop waiting for answers that never came." "I'm sorry," she whispered again, though she knew it changed nothing. He reached across the table then, not to touch her, but to stop her from apologizing. "Olivia, I don't hate you. I never did. I just Stopped needing you to understand me." The finality in his tone was both mercy and punishment. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. They left the cafe in silence. Outside, the city was blanketed in snow. Daniel hailed a cab, holding the door open for her. "Where to?" he asked. "Home," she said. "Chelsea." He nodded, and for a moment, she thought he might get in with her, that they might talk until dawn the way they used to. But he didn't. He closed the door gently, gave her a small nod, and turned away before the cab pulled off. Through the rear window, she watched him fade into the snow, his figure swallowed by the city that had both made and destroyed them. That night back in her apartment, Olivia couldn't sleep. She took out her notebook for the first time in years and began to write. Not for work, not for anyone else, just for herself. The words came slowly at first, then all at once, like a confession. "I thought success would fill the spaces where love once lived, but I was wrong. I thought choosing a man who owned the world would make me belong to it, but I only ended up losing myself. And now the man I once left behind has become everything I wanted to be. Free." Days turned into weeks. She started writing every morning, small essays about regret, redemption, and the quiet ache of time. One of them she submitted anonymously to an online magazine. To her surprise, it went viral. People called it a letter to the one who got away. Comments flooded in, some full of empathy, others filled with their own confessions. For the first time, Olivia realized that heartbreak was a language everyone spoke, but few admitted to. She received an email from the editor inviting her to contribute regularly. For the first time in years, she said yes without hesitation. Her words began to reach people the way Daniel's novels did. She didn't write for fame, she wrote to understand herself. Each essay felt like stitching together pieces of a life she had once torn apart. She never mentioned names, never wrote directly about Daniel, but his presence lingered in every line. The man who loved quietly, forgave silently, and taught her what truth really was. Months later, as spring approached, Olivia attended another of Daniel's readings, not as a ghost this time, but as someone finally whole. She sat near the front, listening as he spoke about how pain, when faced honestly, becomes art. Their eyes met once, briefly, and something passed between them. Not love reborn, not longing, but recognition, the kind that says, "We survived." When the event ended, she didn't go up to him. She didn't need to. They had already said everything that mattered, even in silence. Outside, the night was soft, the city alive again. Olivia walked home alone, the sound of her heels echoing against the pavement. For the first time, she didn't feel the need to look back. The past was still there, but it no longer held her. It had become part of her story, a story she was finally ready to tell. Spring unfolded like a slow awakening, the city shedding its gray skin for color again. Olivia's life had begun to take shape in quiet, deliberate ways. Her essays had found an audience, not millions, but enough to make her feel less invisible. Every piece she wrote carried fragments of her truth, regret stitched into resilience, guilt softened by time. The online magazine offered her a regular column titled Silent Lessons, a name chosen by the editor, but one that felt eerily fitting. Her readers wrote letters filled with their own heartbreaks, stories of love lost and found, of choices that couldn't be undone. Through their confessions, Olivia realized she wasn't alone. She was part of a world filled with people trying to forgive themselves. One morning, while reviewing submissions, she received an unexpected email. The subject line read, "Panel Invitation, The Art of Emotional Truth." The event was hosted by a literary organization, bringing together writers whose work explored themes of love and loss. As she scanned the list of participants, her breath caught when she saw his name, Daniel Brooks, author of The Quiet Leaving. For a moment, she considered declining, but something deeper than fear stirred in her, a need for closure that words alone hadn't granted. She replied with a simple yes. The panel took place in a sunlit hall at Columbia University. Rows of chairs filled quickly, and cameras flashed as guests settled in. Olivia wore a cream blouse and black trousers, her hair swept back in a modest bun. When Daniel entered, the room shifted again, the way it always seemed to when he was near. He nodded when he saw her, a brief acknowledgement that carried both warmth and distance. When the moderator introduced them, Olivia smiled politely, pretending her heart wasn't pounding. They spoke about truth in storytelling, about transforming pain into art. Daniel's voice was steady, measured. The hardest part, he said, is not writing about what hurt you, it's writing without hating the person who did. His words cut through her like glass. The audience applauded, unaware of the history sitting between them. When it was her turn, Olivia said, "Sometimes we write not to forgive others, but to forgive the versions of ourselves that once made the wrong choice." Daniel glanced at her then, a flicker of something unreadable passing through his eyes. After the panel, a small reception followed. Olivia found herself alone near the balcony, the noise of conversation fading behind her. Daniel approached, holding 2 glasses of wine. "You were good," he said. "Honest." She took the glass. "That's the least I can be now." He leaned against the railing beside her, the city stretching endlessly below. "I've been reading your essays," he admitted. "They're raw, beautiful in a painful way." She blinked in surprise. "You read them?" "Of course. You have a way of making silence feel like a character." She smiled faintly. "You always saw poetry in things I thought were broken." "Maybe because broken things don't pretend to be whole," he said quietly. They stood in silence for a moment, watching the sun sink behind the skyscrapers. It felt almost like the old days, before ambition and betrayal had turned them into strangers. "Do you ever wonder," she asked softly, "if we were too young to understand what love really was?" Daniel thought for a moment. Maybe. But youth wasn't the problem. Fear was. Fear of what? "Of losing ourselves in someone else," he said. "You ran because you were afraid to disappear into a life that felt smaller than your dreams. I let you go because I was afraid that loving you meant never becoming who I needed to be." His honesty left her breathless. There was no bitterness in his tone, only acceptance. She wanted to tell him how many nights she had replayed their last conversation, how often she had imagined rewriting it. But she didn't. Instead, she said, "You found your way." "So did you," he replied, "even if it wasn't the easy way." Before they parted, Daniel handed her a small folded note. "I'm teaching a creative writing workshop next month," he said. "You should come by, as a guest speaker. You have a voice worth sharing." She hesitated, then took it. "I'll think about it." "Do," he said, smiling gently. "Not everything between us has to end in goodbye." When he walked away, she unfolded the note. It was a quote in his handwriting. "We write to turn silence into something that speaks back." Daniel Brooks. She slipped it into her notebook, unsure whether it was a gesture of friendship or something deeper. The following weeks passed in a blur of deadlines and quiet anticipation. She reread Daniel's novels, each one layered with more truth than she'd realized before. There was pain in his writing, yes, but also grace. He had learned how to love the world even after it disappointed him. Inspired, she began drafting her own manuscript, a memoir woven through essays, tentatively titled What Remains of Love. Writing it was like excavating her soul. Each page peeled back a layer of pretense until all that was left was honesty. When the day of the workshop came, Olivia almost didn't go. Standing outside the community arts center, she felt the old familiar tremor of doubt. But then she remembered his word, "Not everything has to end in goodbye," and stepped inside. The room was warm and filled with young writers. Daniel smiled when he saw her. "You made it." "I said I'd think about it," she teased. "And you did." During the session, they spoke together about vulnerability, about the courage it takes to write what you're afraid to live. The students listened, rapt, unaware of the story beneath their words. When it ended, one of them asked, "Do you think love and forgiveness are the same thing?" Olivia answered first. "No," she said softly. "Forgiveness is letting someone exist in your heart without needing them to stay." Daniel looked at her then, a quiet understanding passing between them that didn't need translation. After the workshop, as they packed up, Daniel said, "You know, I think we've both been writing different sides of the same story all along." "Maybe now it's time to finish it," she replied. "Together?" he asked, half teasing. "No," she said, smiling sadly. "Separately, but in peace. They left the center together, walking toward opposite subway lines. The air smelled like spring rain and renewal. When they reached the corner, she turned to him one last time. "Thank you, Daniel," she said, "for forgiving me." "I didn't forgive you," he said softly. "I forgave the part of me that couldn't stop loving you." Then he walked away, his silhouette fading into the crowd. Olivia stood there for a long moment, the city alive around her, her heart strangely calm. She realized then that this quiet ending was what redemption truly felt like. Not dramatic, not loud, but soft and steady, like the sound of footsteps moving forward. She smiled to herself, whispered goodbye to the man she once broke, and began walking toward the rest of her life. The months that followed were unlike anything Olivia had known before. Calm, grounded, quietly transformative. She no longer lived in the shadow of what she'd lost, but in the light of what she was finally becoming. Her memoir, What Remains of Love, had begun to take shape. The pages were messy and raw, but real. Each morning she wrote at her small kitchen table with sunlight spilling across the floor, her coffee growing cold as she lost herself in words. It wasn't ambition that drove her anymore. It was truth. She had spent years chasing validation, trying to prove her worth through someone else's gaze. Now her only audience was the reflection in the window, the woman she had finally started to forgive. Occasionally she saw Daniel. They kept their distance, connected by mutual respect and an unspoken tenderness that no longer demanded resolution. Sometimes they would meet at literary events, exchange brief smiles, maybe share a few quiet words before blending back into their separate lives. Each encounter felt like a punctuation mark, a reminder of how far they had come from who they used to be. Once, after a reading in the village, he found her sitting alone at a cafe. "How's the book?" he asked, sliding into the seat across from her. "It's honest," she said, choosing her words carefully, "which makes it painful." "Good," he said. "Pain that tells the truth is the kind worth feeling." She laughed softly. "You make suffering sound poetic." "I'm a writer," he replied, smiling. "It's what we do." They talked for hours that night, about stories, about solitude, about how people change. When the conversation drifted toward the past, it no longer hurt. It was like discussing a dream that had long since ended. Before leaving, Daniel reached into his coat pocket and handed her a small envelope. "It's a letter," he said. "One I wrote years ago, but never sent. I think it's time you read it." That night, Olivia sat by the window, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter. "Olivia, when you left, I tried to hate you. I thought that would make it easier. But every time I sat down to write, I realized hate requires energy, and I didn't have any left. You took it all with you, the good and the bad. For a long time, I thought your silence was punishment. Now I think it was mercy. You didn't owe me explanations. Sometimes people leave not because they stop loving, but because they can't love themselves where they are. If that's what you needed, then I'm glad you left. It made me learn how to live without resentment, and maybe that's the closest thing to forgiveness there is." She read it again and again, until the ink blurred from her tears. Not tears of sorrow, but of release. It was the first time she truly believed that forgiveness could exist without reconciliation. She wrote back, though she never sent it. "I left because I thought the world could give me what love couldn't. I was wrong. But I'm grateful now, not because we ended, but because we began. You taught me how to see myself without illusion. That's a gift I'll never forget." Her book neared completion that summer. The final chapter terrified her the most. It demanded she write about Daniel, not as the man she once betrayed, but as the mirror that forced her to confront who she had become. When she finally finished, she sat back and cried quietly. The kind of tears that don't break you, but cleanse you. The memoir was published in the fall. It wasn't a bestseller, but it found its readers, the kind of people who understood the beauty of quiet endings. Critics called it hauntingly intimate and a meditation on emotional accountability. Daniel sent her a short message. "You wrote it the way it needed to be written. I'm proud of you." She replied simply, "Thank you for everything." Life moved forward in small, steady rhythms. Olivia began teaching creative writing workshops for women rebuilding after heartbreak. She encouraged them to write the stories they were afraid to tell, to stop defining themselves by who they once loved or who had left them behind. Her classroom became a refuge, a place where silence turned into strength. One day after a session, she found a student lingering by the door. "I read your book," the young woman said shyly. "It made me forgive someone I thought I never could." Olivia smiled. "Then you've already won." That night, walking home through Central Park, Olivia thought of how life had a way of circling back, not to repeat itself, but to show you how much you'd grown. She passed a couple holding hands, their laughter echoing through the cool air, and she didn't feel envy, only peace. When she reached her apartment, there was an envelope slipped under her door. It was from Daniel. Inside was an invitation to the premiere of the film adaptation of The Quiet Leaving. The screening was held at a small independent theater downtown. Olivia went, though she sat in the back, unnoticed. The film was beautiful, subtle, melancholic, and deeply human. The final scene showed the protagonist standing by a window, whispering a line that wasn't in the book. Sometimes love doesn't need a sequel. It just needs silence to mean something. She knew then that Daniel had written that for her. After the credits rolled, she waited until the crowd had thinned before approaching him. He turned when she said his name. "I wasn't sure you'd come," he said. "I wasn't sure either," she replied. "But I wanted to see how the story ended." "And?" he asked, half smiling. "It ended exactly the way it should have." They stood for a moment, the hum of the projector fading behind them. "You know," he said, "I think we finally did it." "Did what?" "Learn to love each other without needing to be together." Olivia nodded. Maybe that's what real love always was. They didn't hug, didn't make promises, didn't say goodbye. They just looked at each other one last time. Two people who had survived the storm and found the stillness afterward. Then Daniel walked away, leaving her under the soft glow of the marquee lights. She didn't follow. She didn't have to. When she stepped outside, the city air was crisp, the streets glistening from recent rain. Olivia lifted her face toward the night sky and smiled. The kind of smile born not of happiness, but of peace. She finally understood that regret and redemption could coexist. That loving someone deeply didn't mean you were meant to stay. It simply meant they had changed you in ways you would carry forever. And for the first time, she felt free. The first snow of winter came early that year, soft and silent, settling over New York like a memory. Olivia watched it fall from her apartment window, her breath fogging the glass. The city looked almost kind beneath the whiteness, the chaos muted, the edges blurred. It reminded her of that night years ago when she had walked away from Daniel's apartment without looking back. How strange, she thought, that the same snow could mean something entirely different now. Then it was an ending. Tonight, it felt like grace. Her life had settled into something she once would have called ordinary. But now she knew that ordinary could be a gift. She taught 2 classes a week at the Community Arts Center, freelanced for a handful of publications, and spent her evenings writing in the quiet. Her days were hers again, and that was enough. Her memoir had opened unexpected doors. A publisher approached her about turning What Remains of Love into a podcast, a series exploring the art of forgiveness. She hesitated at first, unsure if she wanted her voice to become that exposed, but eventually agreed. Each episode paired her with someone sharing a story of love, loss, and redemption. She spoke not as a therapist or expert, but as someone who had lived through her own reckoning. It was raw, imperfect, human, and it resonated. The audience grew quickly, emails flooding in from listeners who saw themselves in her words. Olivia didn't chase fame anymore, yet somehow it found her again, but in a gentler way. Months passed quietly until one afternoon, her producer handed her an envelope. "A listener sent this," he said. "Said it was personal." Olivia opened it after the recording session. Inside was a single page, handwritten in familiar ink. "Your voice sounds lighter now," it read. "I'm glad you found peace. I've started something new too. A novel about beginnings that don't erase endings. Maybe one day we'll talk about it. Until then, keep writing. D," she smiled, pressing the letter against her chest. Daniel had always found ways to reach her without intrusion, to speak when silence said enough. Weeks later, she received an official invitation to the launch of Daniel's new book, The Weight of Light. It was to be held at the same bookstore where he had read from The Quiet Leaving years earlier. Olivia hadn't stepped into that space since, but something inside her urged her to go. Not out of nostalgia, but acknowledgement. She owed that much to the story they had both survived. The evening of the launch was crisp and golden, the streets glowing with early holiday lights. The bookstore was filled to the brim, literary critics, students, and admirers all pressed close, waiting. Daniel stood at the podium, older now but radiant in the way peace makes someone beautiful. When he began to read, his voice filled the room, steady and sure. The passage was from the final chapter of his book. There are people who pass through your life like seasons. You can't keep the warmth of summer and winter, but you remember how it felt. Some loves aren't meant to be carried forward. They're meant to be understood. Olivia closed her eyes, the words washing over her. She didn't feel the sharp sting of regret anymore, only the soft ache of recognition. When the event ended, she waited as others crowded around him for autographs and photos. When the crowd thinned, Daniel noticed her. For a brief second, his expression faltered, then softened into something unguarded. "You came," he said when she approached. "I always seem to, don't I?" she replied with a small smile. "You always did like endings," he said lightly. "Not this time," she answered. "This feels like something else." They stepped outside into the cold night, the city glowing behind them. For a long while they said nothing. The quiet between them had changed. It no longer carried tension, only understanding. "I read your latest essay," Daniel said at last, "the one about closure." "And," she asked, "you were right. Closure isn't about doors closing. It's about learning to stand in the doorway and not need to walk through." She laughed softly. "You always did make my words sound smarter than they are." "No," he said, "just truer." They stopped at the corner near the old coffee shop where they used to sit after long nights of talking about dreams. It was still there, the same neon sign flickering above the door. "Do you want to?" he began, but she shook her head gently. "No, let's leave it where it is. Some memories are meant to stay untouched." He nodded, understanding. "You're right." They stood for a moment longer, the snow beginning to fall again. Olivia looked up, watching the flakes drift lazily through the streetlights. "You know," she said, "I used to think regret was the worst kind of pain. Now I think it's necessary. It keeps us humble. Maybe that's why writers need it," he said with a half smile. "Without regret, we'd have nothing worth saying. And without love," she added, "we'd have nothing worth regretting." Daniel looked at her then, the kind of look that feels like the last page of a book you're not ready to close. "You've changed," he said quietly. "So have you." "I guess we both finally grew into the people we were trying to become back then." "Maybe we always were those people," she said. "We just had to lose each other to see it." He reached out then, not to hold her, but to tuck a stray strand of hair behind her ear. The gesture was small, familiar, almost sacred. "Take care of yourself, Olivia," he said. "You too, Daniel." She hesitated, then added, "Thank you for never turning our story into something bitter." He smiled. It was never bitterness, just truth. She watched him walk away, his figure dissolving into the snow-dusted street. This time she didn't feel the weight of goodbye. She turned in the opposite direction, her steps light, her breath visible in the cold air. The city was alive around her, full of sounds and stories she hadn't yet lived. Later that night in her apartment, Olivia opened her journal and wrote, "Love doesn't always end with loss. Sometimes it ends with peace. Sometimes it becomes the quiet knowing that what once hurt now simply exists, and that's enough." She closed the book, turned off the lamp, and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the faint hum of the city. There was no melancholy, only gratitude, the kind that comes when you realize you have finally outlived your ghosts. For the first time in years, Olivia felt entirely present, not the woman who had left or been left, but the woman who had learned to stay. Not in anyone else's story, but her own. Spring returned once more, softer than before, carrying a gentleness that Olivia had learned to recognize as healing. The air was mild, the city alive with color, and for the first time in years, she felt no trace of the restlessness that used to haunt her. Her days moved with a quiet rhythm. Mornings spent writing, afternoons walking through Central Park, evenings teaching small groups of writers who looked at her with the same hunger she once carried. Her podcast had grown into something meaningful, a place where people came to speak about love without judgment. Strangers told her their stories, and she listened, not as an expert, but as someone who understood how fragile the human heart could be. Each episode ended with the same line she had written for herself years ago. "We are all just trying to love better than we did before." She hadn't seen Daniel in months, though his presence remained like a calm pulse somewhere in her life. Every so often, she'd come across an article about him, an award, a lecture, a quiet recognition of his growing influence. It made her smile, not with longing, but with pride. They had both found their ways to survive the same story. One afternoon in early May, a letter arrived in her mailbox written in Daniel's unmistakable handwriting. Inside was an invitation to a small gathering in Vermont, a retreat he was hosting for writers, tucked away in the mountains where noise couldn't follow. She read it twice before setting it aside. A part of her hesitated. Another part, the part that had stopped running from memory, knew she would go. The cabin where the retreat was held was nothing like the polished event spaces of the city. It was simple, built of cedar and glass, surrounded by quiet pines. When Olivia arrived, Daniel was waiting by the porch, sleeves rolled up, a notebook in hand. "You made it," he said, smiling in that calm, familiar way. "I needed the air," she replied, setting her bag down, "and maybe the silence." "Silence is the only honest company for words," he said. They spent the next few days surrounded by a handful of writers, sharing stories, discussing craft, walking through the forest trails that smelled of rain and pine. It was peaceful in a way that didn't ask for more. On the final evening, the group gathered around a fire outside. The sky was streaked with orange and violet, the kind of beauty that made you forget time existed. One by one, the writers read pieces they had written during the retreat. When it was Olivia's turn, she unfolded a small sheet of paper. "This isn't fiction," she said softly, "but maybe it's a story." She began to read about a woman who left a man who loved her, thinking she was chasing freedom, only to discover years later that love wasn't a cage, it was a mirror. Her voice trembled at first, then steadied. When she finished, no one spoke for a long while. The fire crackled, and Daniel finally said, "That's the most honest thing you've ever written." She met his eyes across the glow of the fire. "It took me years to find the courage." "Maybe that's how long truth needs," he said. Later, when the others had gone to bed, they stayed by the dying fire, wrapped in the hum of crickets and the whisper of the wind through trees. Daniel poured her tea from a small thermos. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked. "The life we almost had?" She considered the question carefully. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but not the way I used to. I think I miss who we were when we still believed love could fix everything." "It never could," he said gently, "but it taught us how to break without staying broken." She smiled faintly. "You always knew how to make the pain sound beautiful." "You were the one who made it real," he said. They sat in silence after that, the kind that no longer hurt. The years between them had softened the edges, turned what was once unbearable into something sacred. When she finally stood to leave, Daniel didn't stop her, didn't ask her to stay. He simply said, "I'm glad we found our peace." "So am I," she whispered. "It's strange, isn't it? How love can end but never really disappear." He nodded. "That's because the people we love become part of the language we use to understand ourselves." The next morning, before heading back to New York, Olivia found a small envelope on her bedside table. Inside was a note from Daniel. "For the book you haven't written yet, the one about what comes after forgiveness, don't make it about me. Make it about how you learn to stay." She folded the note carefully, slipping it into her journal. On the drive home, she watched the mountains fade in the rearview mirror, feeling a quiet satisfaction settle over her. For so long, she had lived inside a story defined by leaving. Now she had learned the art of staying, not with someone else, but within herself. Back in the city, she returned to her usual rhythm. Her podcast continued to grow, her classes filled, her words reached people she would never meet. Yet some nights, when the world went still, she would sit by the window with a cup of tea and think of that fire in Vermont, of Daniel's calm eyes across the flame. Not with longing, but with gratitude. They had walked through love, betrayal, regret, and come out the other side whole. That was enough. Months later, at a bookstore downtown, a young woman approached her after a reading. "Your work changed me," the girl said. "I thought forgiveness was weakness until I read your essays." Olivia smiled softly. "Forgiveness isn't weakness," she said. "It's choosing peace over pride." "Do you think everyone deserves it?" the girl asked. Olivia thought of Daniel, of the years they had lost and the people they had become. "Maybe not everyone," she said, "but we deserve it for ourselves." That night, as she walked home through the quiet streets, the city lights shimmered like distant stars. She felt a deep stillness settle within her, a kind of peace that came not from forgetting, but from remembering without pain. When she reached her apartment, she opened her journal and began to write again. Not about loss this time, but about beginning. The words came easily, flowing like water. "There was a man I loved once. I broke his heart, and he broke my silence. We didn't end where we started, but maybe that was the point. Love isn't about possession or permanence. It's about recognition of the places we meet and the courage it takes to let each other go." She closed the notebook and smiled. Outside, spring rain tapped gently against the glass. Somewhere in the city, she imagined Daniel writing too, their words drifting through the same night air, separate but in harmony, like two notes in a song that had finally found its ending. And for the first time in her life, Olivia understood that endings were never truly endings, just quiet transitions into a different kind of love, the one you carry with you, quietly, always. The story that began with her leaving had finally found its peace in staying,